ever felt like you've just said the most awkward thing to a grieving person? Yeah, I've done it too. Welcome to the Parable Podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Zapchenk, and today we're going to have the second part of a candid conversation with my friend Greg Bufkin, who in 2015 lost his son, Ryan. As a trigger warning, we reference suicide, and so if you are in a place with little ears or you're just working through this right now, please feel free to move on to a previous episode. We all deal with loss or grief in some way, and so our hope in today's conversation is what it looks like when we can be there for one another, how some words can be harmful and we need to be mindful of that, and what we can do instead as a support system. Here's my conversation with Greg Bufkin. Well, today we are jumping back into our second conversation about loss and grief, but from more of an external perspective. Like, how do we interact with people, right, Greg?
Right.
How do we go into the world? How is this affecting our communities, our family, our friends? And so I'd love to start with, is it lighthearted? I don't know. But what has been some of those things that people have maybe said to you and Kathy in the moment? Gosh, it hurt really bad because I think people in their kindness, they're trying to say certain things that are loving, but it comes across, it can be really painful. We're kind of taking this as a moment of here's what not to say, or here's some adjustments of how we can be better supporters of our friends and family.
And that's a really good question, Danielle. And yes, here we are 8 years later, and I can have a much different perspective on that than I did a few months or even a couple of years into it. I didn't really find it very humorous in the early stages. Now I can look back with grace. I can see from a perspective of, well, they really didn't have a clue. They don't understand. And the truth of the matter is we don't want them to be able to understand because that means they would have to experience it themselves. So as I think back, we live in South Carolina. So in the South, when you meet somebody, typically the first thing out of your mouth is, hey, how you doing? When somebody says that to you, somebody asks you that question, I should say, and it's been a couple of weeks, just lost your child, and somebody asks you how you're doing. All this is happening in your brain in terms of milliseconds. And it's like, really? So let's see. Well, our child died a couple of weeks ago, and, I'm here in the grocery store, and all I wanted to do was to pick this up and get out of here as quickly as I can without having to have this conversation. Because if you really want to know the answer to how am I doing, have you got a couple of hours?
Yeah.
I mean, really. But of course, they didn't know that.
Sure.
So, you have to offer, that's why I say you have to offer grace because they don't know. But it's totally different when it's somebody that you do know and they say, how are you doing? It's like, I know they mean well, but if they really knew how I was doing on the inside, they might not have asked that question, or maybe they could have rephrased it. And that's something that we try to help other people understand as well. Consider your words. Mm-hmm. Instead of saying, how are you doing? You could even change it to something so simple as, so how are you getting along? Mm. How are you working through this today? Just a different set of words. I can remember one in particular. I mean, this one stands out like one of those moments where you hit your thumb with a hammer. So this is probably 4 years after we lost Ryan. So we're in the mountains of North Carolina. It's our favorite go-to spot. And it's usually a place where we can go and we don't see people that we know, generally speaking. So Kathy and I are in the grocery store. We had just gotten there and put our stuff in the cabin, went to get all of our supplies at the grocery store, and we hear this familiar voice. Gosh, who is this? I know this voice. Well, we turn a corner and come face to face, not with the guy that I thought it was, but with his wife.
Yeah.
And we had not seen them since probably a couple of years before we lost Ryan. We went to church together for years and years. We went on a missions trip to Europe together, and they have a daughter who was about Ryan's age, and they had a crush on each other. There was a little bit of a relationship there that kind of brings you, it just adds a new dimension to a relationship with the parents there. So we had a good relationship with these folks when we were at the same church. But when we lost Ryan, we never heard from them. No phone call, no text, no card, no response whatsoever. And that hurt. It just hurt. So back to this grocery store, we come face to face with her, and it's like awkward moment, and you can't escape. There's nowhere to go. And she and I, and about 10 seconds later, Kathy comes walking up, and it's like, okay, here's this very awkward moment. And then her husband walks up. And so it's just sort of typical chit chat. They're in the mountains, we're in the mountains. Hey, you guys want to hang out while we're here and get some supper together or something? And so I'm going, oh my gosh, no, we really don't. You talk about awkward. That would be an awkward meal. And then I can hear Kathy and this other friend, the wife, having a conversation. And what I hear is Kathy asking her, finally, after all of this other chit chat, did you guys know that we had lost Ryan? And her response was, it seems like we heard something about that. What? Yeah. And then I hear her say, and wasn't there a child involved or something like that? And we're like, oh my gosh, where's the escape button? Yeah. Where's that escape hatch in the floor that we can just drop through and get as far away from this spot as we possibly can? I cannot begin to describe what a surreal experience that was like. I will never be able to really wrap my head around how could you possibly respond by saying, it seems like I heard something about that. Yeah. I know that it wasn't meant in a mean-spirited way, but oh my gosh, if she had only known how deeply that cut. So yeah, there was stuff like that. And, now we can look back and, you forgive because you just have to realize people that have never been there don't have any perspective. We choose to give them credit now that when it happened was a little not quite as easy to do. I think generally speaking, people mean well. I think some of those careless things that they say just come out of not having a clue how to respond because, let's face it, when was the last time you were in a church that offered a course or a seminar on how to walk through grief with a friend, where you learned what the impact of grief was and how you come alongside a friend and help them? I never did. I never experienced that. Yeah. God doesn't package us up with an understanding of that. And I think it kind of goes back to, and I know this is sort of a side note, but I was on a Zoom call with some other guys who had recently experienced the death of a child. And they had invited me to share our story. And one of the things that one of the guys said, and I think he was a pastor, it really hit me. He said, in God's original design, we were never supposed to experience death. I started thinking about that and realized, that is absolutely true. We were supposed to have an eternal relationship with God right from the very beginning. And we're the ones who screwed that up through disobedience. And that brought sin into the world that separated us from God. And the result of that is death, physical death and spiritual death. So no wonder it's so awkward for people. And no wonder it's such a hard thing to try to navigate because we were never meant to.
It's that weird tension and it's an awkwardness because if we've never experienced grief, we're trying to file through in our mind as the listener, as the person who's in the grocery store of okay, what do I know about this situation? Or what have I experienced that somehow we feel that we can equate what you've experienced. And then it just comes out in a weird thing of oh yeah, I've lost my dog too, and you're just while I'm sorry for your loss, it isn't the same in that sense. And so there's a couple things that I would say to this because I have said some dumb stuff. I have felt so awkward because I do care but how do I be sensitive? And so one of the things is for myself personally is just listening. And the question that I use for so many things is tell me more. Or tell me how you're feeling. How do you feel about that? Now, you have to choose to be in a place where you're willing to do that. And so I think for somebody who's on the other end of grief and loss, you have to choose, how much do I want to share with this person? Like, is this somebody that's in the grocery store and I'm going to tell them my life story? Or is this a friend that is ready to actually listen and walk alongside this grief or this loss, this traumatic experience with me? So, I mean, it's kind of a learning journey, because just as you said in the previous episode, like, you're learning, like, what does grief look like in my life? And for the listener, the person that's kind of walking along, like, how do I do this? I've never experienced this before, and I don't want to be the person that says the wrong thing, right?
Yeah. And I think it's just because we become so self-conscious in those moments. And I mean, if it makes you feel any better, Kathy and I have been there. And yet, now over the course of the last 8 years, we've met quite a few people who have lost a child. And I've interviewed everybody that I interview, almost without exception on my podcast, has walked through child loss. And sometimes it is just really difficult and awkward to know what to say, because we want to say, I think we really naturally want to say something that we think is going to help or that's going to comfort them. But that's the mistake that we make. We think that we can fix them. Something that we say will be like a Band-Aid. It'll fix them. They'll feel better. And we can have our real relationship back. Because that's what it's like, oh my gosh, they're not the same people anymore. Are they ever going to be the same people? And so we're trying to navigate all of this as somebody looking in from the outside. And the best thing to do a lot of times is just to offer the gift of your presence and just be there for them, but not to try to apply particularly spiritual Band-Aids or Band-Aids, if you'll just do this and you offer a verse of scripture. It's not that that's wrong. It's just that it was maybe ill-timed. Maybe a few months from now, you could say the same thing and it might be a whole lot more comforting. But we do need to be careful that, it's not up to us to fix them. They're not a project. Be careful not to start thinking of your grieving friend as a project that you need to get involved to fix. But be involved, yes. Love on them and be there for them.
Yeah. One of the things that we had is like a small group guideline, and there was a whole bunch of them, but it's just one of them I always remember is like, it is not my job to fix people. It's really just to listen. And obviously, if they ask for your opinion, if
that's
they
different.
Ask for guidance, great. But just like to be mindful of that, because for some people's nature, they're just like, okay, well, have you tried this? I have a friend who is dealing with some complications that have come out through COVID. And the amount of things that people have sent her, like she just wants like friendship in her life. She needs people to be there, but they're just like, have you tried these goji berries if you put them in a tea? And she just told me the other day, she's like, I can't even get out of my bed. How am I going to make this tea? Are you going to come over? So,
yeah, really.
When we think about that, just being mindful, it's going to be awkward. It's going to be this weird dance. And hopefully, like you said, like just as out of this relationship of grace.
Yeah, I was going to say, just realize that if you think it's awkward for you looking in from the outside, you can multiply that by 1,000 times over how awkward it is for the one who's grieving, trying to act normal when they're face to face with you and trying to carry on some level of a relationship. It's just, grief is it's just so awkward. Nothing easy about it.
Yeah. Well, in the previous episode, we talked about really like the internal process, but how do you, when you're ready, I mean, because this journey is going to take different ways for each person, how do you build a support network? Because I think that's really crucial for dealing with grief. Can you talk, Greg, about like what the role of friends or family members or maybe people like in support groups that you didn't even know existed have helped play a role in this time that's been really challenging?
That is such an important question. I'm glad, really, really glad that you brought that up, because the truth of the matter is, we all are going to face moments like this at some point in our lives. You may not lose a child. I pray you don't. But you're going to face something where you're going to need other people. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you don't believe it, you just haven't lived long enough. I have. What I would tell you is don't start building that network of people after it happens. It's not to say that it can't be done, but that's not the optimal time to do that. Kathy and I had people in place in our lives already before we lost Ryan, and had for years. We were part of a church fellowship. That's just part of our lives. That's who we are. We were also involved in small groups. And if you're listening today, you don't know what a small group is. Sometimes we call them Bible studies. Sometimes we just call them life groups. But it's just people who are in relationship with each other, friends. Sometimes we go to church together, but we just do life together. We meet, I don't know, maybe once a week, maybe a couple of weeks, couple times a month. We eat together. We hang out, we have a good time, and we just share life, and we talk about just the stuff of life. And sometimes the stuff of life involves the really heavy stuff, loss and grief, and from a lot of different sources. Mm-hmm. But when something like this happens, they're there. They're already in place. All you have to do is make a phone call. And these are the kind of people that I'm talking about that you could call at 2:00 in the morning. And if you needed them to be there, they would be there. And if there was enough physical distance between you and they couldn't be there immediately, these are the people that would start praying for you right then and there. Mm-hmm. So to your point, Danielle, it absolutely is crucial. God did not intend for us to live our lives as the Lone Ranger. We were meant to be in relationships with other people. And it's in life-altering events like that when you really come to understand why that was God's design. Yeah. Because they do become a lifeline for you. And Kathy and I were just so very blessed to have those people. And we still have some of those same people that we do life with on a regular basis now. That couple that was there with us in the mountains, we still do life together with them. Wow. Yeah, if you don't have it, get it. Do whatever you got to do to get relationships like that. And it requires a little bit of work.
It does. It does require a bit of work. I mean, depending on the season of your life, or maybe you have moved, you're at a different church. It is so hard because is this worth it? Because it's one thing when you have just your regular day-to-day, maybe you have work commitments, family, other friends in your life, or just you're trying to take some time for yourself, to have the act of like, okay, I am purposely going to build in time and space for other people so that I can learn from them, they can learn from me, and then hopefully one day, we can continue to be there for each other. It is hard. And so I think sometimes it becomes a barrier, but in situations like this, when we are faced with the harshness of reality, gosh, God is so good to have those experiences and those people set in place in our life.
Oh, absolutely. And yes, like you said, it might require a little bit of work and intentionality to begin with, but man, once you have it and you've experienced it for some weeks, months, then you realize how much you love it, how much value and richness it adds to your life. These people add to your life. And then you can't imagine life without it. Like I said before about Jesus, if you don't have those kind of people in your life right now, if you're not a part of that, man, if you have any ability to do so, just try it.
Mm-hmm. Jesus, he was so good at extending compassion. That's something like a muscle we need to work on in our daily lives day to day. And I'm sure compassion was a process for you and Kathy, because as you were dealing with your own grief, now you have to extend grace and compassion, who've also experienced loss as well. Talk to me a little bit about what compassion has looked like, how that has evolved for you after Ryan's passing.
We knew early on after losing Ryan that at some point, in some way, shape, or form, we wanted to be able to help other parents who had been through a loss like ours. God's timing is perfect. I was still working full time And I didn't really know what that was going to look like. But it's interesting how along the way, God will bring other people into your life who have had similar life experiences. Unfortunately, we have met so many other parents who have lost a child. You kind of feel like you're so isolated when that happens that nobody else could possibly understand. Mm-hmm. And then you start realizing how many other people out there have walked through the same thing or who are walking through the same thing. And so once people know that you've been through that, people will put you in touch with other people who have been through similar loss. And it's a God-given compassion, I believe, because of God's Spirit living in us. I've met so many people through our podcast, some of the most amazing people that I have ever met in my life who have been through the worst that life can throw at them. And they are people that are just filled with this joy, with purpose and meaning, and live life intentionally. And that's what we want to do through our podcast, is to help people understand that on that grief journey, there is also hope. There's also joy. There's peace. There's abundance. You can rediscover purpose and meaning in life again. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, sometimes people can get stuck in their grief.
Yeah.
And it does happen. There's actually a mental health disorder now called prolonged grief disorder. And it's actually a part of the psychiatric handbook on diagnostics and coding. And it's where people get stuck in the grief and they can't seem to move forward. And that's what we want to help other people understand, that in a relationship with Jesus, they can have that. They don't have to stay there. It's okay not to be okay for a while. It's just not okay to stay not okay.
Yeah.
All of these people that I have met and have interviewed, such a large percentage of them have gone on in their own grief to establish foundations. They've established ministries. Some of them have started their own podcast, but they want to help other people. And it amazes me how God can take something so horrendous and bring so much good out of it. Gosh, it seems like he said something about that, like Romans 8:28. God in all things can bring good out of that. He can bring good out and use it for good in the lives of so many people.
Gosh, I think that's why both of us, like, stories matter. We just sometimes reflect and think, like, is this usable? Is this helpful to anyone? Does it matter? And I do believe it does, because when we see a similarity, maybe it's not exactly the same, in someone else, they're just like, wow, if they've done this, look at how far God has helped them along. Like, maybe that's an opportunity for me. And I'm telling you, yes, it is. Like, there is so much goodness that God is going to take out of our brokenness, and he's going to multiply it into something maybe we could have far never imagined. I don't believe you in 2008 thought that you were going to be doing a podcast helping other parents.
I would have told you you were out of your mind.
Yeah.
If you thought that this guy who was so non-techie could have ever learned how to do a podcast, let alone even wanted to try it.
Yeah.
No, that was God ordained.
So cool. People often encounter misconceptions and stigmas related to suicide. I think we've definitely made a lot of advances in our language around that. How have you faced misunderstandings of others? How have you navigated through that?
I think that is a question that a lot of people wrestle with. On my podcast, I have interviewed parents who have lost children to suicide. And just to kind of encapsulate what that does sometimes to a parent, it took me 5 years, Danielle, before I could even use the word suicide after we lost Ryan. I just could not bring myself to say that word. I would always say Ryan took his own life. Somehow that felt better than that very cold, clinical term suicide. And with all the connotations that are attached to that in our culture, unfortunately, even in the church, in Christian culture, I don't think it's as bad as it once was. There was a thread of thought that if you committed suicide, that you were going to go to hell.
Yes.
Period.
I've heard it before.
And I think maybe it was more prevalent here in the South. I don't know. But I grew up hearing that. And so when Ryan took his own life, we came face to face with that very issue. But here's what I know. As I mentioned, I think in the first episode that we recorded, we knew that Ryan, at 5 years of age, he accepted God's free gift of salvation through Jesus. He initiated that. We know that Ryan is in heaven. So we believe, as you do, that our salvation comes by grace through faith, has nothing to do with our works. And Scripture is very clear that nothing can separate us from God through Jesus Christ. Nothing in all of creation. I think that's Romans 8:38. And so you come face to face with that question, and you realize that if that's not true, that if you can take your own life and you're sentenced to hell for all eternity, then what else isn't true about Scripture? What else that Jesus said isn't true? Is Jesus not enough, even for somebody who takes their own life? People often refer back, I think, to the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not kill. In the original, it was thou shalt not murder. But even at that, Jesus talked about what's in your heart. Before you murder somebody, he said there was something there initially that grew out of anger. And that anger grew to the point where someone committed murder. It began with lust that led to adultery. So Jesus took it a step further than what was said in the 10 Commandments. He said, if you have thought that in your heart, then you have committed adultery. If you have been that angry, then you have committed murder. Jesus didn't do away with those laws. He added a whole new component to it. It was about the heart issue. And so we know that in Jesus, our sins are forgiven, past, present, and future. And that's the hope, and that's where our hope rests, because it's the certain hope. It's not like I hope that this will happen. It's the absolute certain hope because of who he is and because of what he said.
So good, Greg. I think the first time I really wrestled with that, because that would be a sentence or a theme, a thread that was a part of my life growing up as well. It was in the background. I mean, I didn't really give it like too much thought until probably a few years ago. Our pastor that I had in our childhood, I remember the day, I believe it was my mom that called, and she said that our pastor has taken his own life. And I couldn't fathom that. I couldn't understand it, which with suicide, you can't. It's just, it doesn't make any sense. I think for me during that season, I wrestled with that. I'm like, is that what it means? Like I went back to Judas in the Bible. I'm like, did he get to be at Jesus's table in heaven later on? Like, these are just like the things, like the honest conversation, and we love someone. And it's hard to fathom, but I loved what you said. Like God could raise Jesus from the dead. Like, where is like the grace continuum? Does it stop there? So like, even like today, like, does my sin if I died today, does God say, oh, but remember you didn't say you're sorry for the things that you did today? That's not how it's going to go. I think it's just, again, like the game we play with our human minds, because we're trying to justify, we're trying to understand, and it's a whole process.
And I think it part of that too, Danielle, don't you think, is because we like to control the narrative.
Of course.
I mean, a little bit, because some of us wrestle with control issues more than others, perhaps. But it goes back to, if that doesn't apply, if what Jesus said about this, if we have decided in our religiosity that this isn't true, then you might as well take the entire Bible and just toss it. Because if one aspect of it is not true, because God's word even says that his word is inerrant, without fault, without any error, it either is or it isn't. There's no in between. So that's how we were able to maintain the peace that God gave us, is by him helping us understand that those principles are true, whether it's suicide, whether it's a car accident, whether it's a shooting or a terminal disease. Nothing can separate us from him.
Reflecting on your own experience with Ryan, are there any insights? I mean, I think I just told you that we have an 11-year-old and a 14-year-old, and like mental health is talked about a lot at their school, which I'm super grateful for.
Yep.
But is there any insight or lessons as a parent, like looking into suicide prevention or the importance of open communication, that you could just kind of say like, hey, here's something I've learned now that I would have loved to incorporate or just be mindful of as we're having conversations with not only our kids, but our friends, our family members?
Yeah, great question. And that is encouraging to hear that they are having those conversations in your kids' schools. I think that's something that needs to get even better. You know, we're making strides, and we have made strides over the past couple of decades or so, particularly, I think. But we've got a long way to go. One of the things that I would say that I would encourage parents with, particularly young parents, because you got to lay the foundation early on, become a student of your child. And what I mean by that is you have to invest yourself. You have to invest time. And that doesn't mean just quality time. That means in order to get that quality time, you have to have a quantity of time. Spend time with your children. And when I say be a student of your child, know what makes your child tick. Know your child's characteristics, the things that move them, the things that set them off, the things that they fear and worry about, all of it. And the list just goes on and on and on. But know them, because if you know what's true, then when something that appears to be off, and when you observe that, then you know that there's something that you need to be aware of, that maybe you need to start having a conversation with your child about, because something just doesn't seem right. It probably seems that way because there's something behind it.
Yeah.
Have an open door of communication with your child, no matter what their behavior looks like, no matter what their choices and decisions are that you don't like. Keep the door of communication open, and always, always, always communicate to them that you love them, even though you may not love their behavior or their choices and decisions, because then you can at least have an open door into what's going on in their heart. And you can ask questions. You can let them tell you what's going on instead of, because I found myself doing this when Ryan was a teenager. It felt like we couldn't put out one fire fast enough before another fire popped up somewhere else.
Yeah.
And so it was like we constantly just were putting out little fires. If I had known what I know now and had actually tried to get to the root of what was causing that fire, whether it was me sitting down and asking him more questions or getting him in front of a counselor who could have done it a whole lot better than me, then could that have possibly changed outcomes along the way? But ultimately, the outcome of him taking his own life, because, as I said in that first episode, there were things that we learned 3 years later that had we known when he was living, maybe if we had known those things, we could have gotten him the help that he needed.
Yeah.
Maybe we would have had a different outcome. I don't know. Those are things that, just initially come to mind. And I would say this too. I think this is probably what is being talked about in some of those classes at your kid's school, because I think it's happening in my grandson's school. And that is, learn to recognize words and phrases that are cries for help. Because when they're in those early to mid-teen years, they don't really know how to process a lot of this stuff themselves. They know what they're feeling and experiencing, but they don't often know what to do with it.
Yeah.
And so they act it out a lot of times. They make poor choices and decisions, and sometimes they just react out of fear. I can tell you specifically, our grandson just a week ago wrote something in his online journal, as it were, on his Chromebook. And the counselors and some of the supervisors in the schools have access to this, and keywords trigger responses from them. And he was expressing the need for some help because of a bullying situation that was going on. So that's why I say just, be aware of those things with your child. And that comes from being a student of your child and taking advantage of professional counselors or counselors that your church provides.
Yeah.
And just learning about this yourself, because we live in a culture that is a very challenging culture. There's a mental health crisis in our country. There aren't enough mental health professionals, and we don't talk about it like we should. For some reason, we treat mental health very differently than we do physical health. If you have something going on with your heart, most of us don't hesitate to go to a cardiologist, or at least go to a family doctor so he can refer us, right?
Yeah.
And we don't have any trouble taking those medications or going through some diagnostic procedure to make sure that, our heart's like in the kind of shape that it ought to be, because our life depends on it, right? Why don't we do that with mental health? Why do we treat our brain like it's nothing but an emotion? And if we were just strong enough, and if we just prayed enough, and if we just did that enough and didn't do that enough, that we would be all better. But that's not the case. There's some stigma, unfortunately, that's still associated with it. And there shouldn't be, particularly in the Christian community.
Absolutely. Yeah. A couple years ago, the majority of our family went to counseling, but who didn't after COVID, right? Reed, our youngest, I would say both of our children, we try our best to be intentional with them. Our oldest daughter, we can't stop her from talking sometimes. So that's easy. But for Reed, things that his anxiety was manifesting in a breathing, and it was scaring him at night. And so as a parent, obviously you want to help, but I'm just like, is it time to see a therapist? And also not knowing exactly what he was saying in there, that was killing me. I was just like,
yeah, I bet.
What's going on? And I just had to give in to the fact, this person is trained. She loves our child, and that we are providing him an opportunity and understanding of how to deal and manage his emotions. I mean, he's young, he's figuring things out. And what does that look like? And yeah, so I would say if somebody is like, gosh, do I go to therapy? Should that be an option for my child? Absolutely. I think when we think of when somebody says just pray about it. And I was one of those people that used to say that all the time. I think God gives us so many opportunities. He gives us medical professionals. He gives us medicine. He gives us support systems where we need to reach out externally, utilize and partake of all of the gifts that God has given us so that we can better ourselves. Don't be ashamed of that. I think that is the pinpoint where Satan tries to hold on to our lives and say, oh, you couldn't do this by yourself. Gosh, that's such a bummer that, you have to take medication. Who cares? You have to take medication with diabetes or allergies.
Or that lie about, well, you know what they're going to think about that.
Yeah.
When these other people find out that my child is going to counseling or that I'm going to counseling, you know what they're going to be thinking. Mm-hmm. And probably most people aren't thinking about that. Yeah. That's you thinking about that. Yeah. And so don't let pride get in the way. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just take advantage. Like you were just saying, God provided these gifted physicians and psychiatrists and counselors. Why would we not take advantage of it? I mean, it's like if you were drowning and you had your hand up out of the water and somebody that you didn't even like put their hand up to get you, would you say, nope, not you? I'll wait for somebody that I like to go. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, we need to put stuff like that to the side and do what's right.
Yeah. And again, that goes back to like why stories matter. I think once we shine a light on these pain points of our lives, these things that are holding us back, that are challenges for us, gosh, then it just helps others know that I am not alone, because the majority of it is so many people are struggling and feeling those same feelings.
Yeah.
And they're just like, thank you. Thank you. I know that I'm not alone. I'm not the only one. Because when we enclose ourselves, like I said earlier, like captivate ourselves in this cell, we need to break free. And like God is going to help you do that. Mm-hmm.
There's so much freedom in that. When you can share your story, it really does help aid the healing process. Mm-hmm. And it allows you to be able to process through how you're feeling as you're expressing your thoughts. Mm-hmm. And not only do you benefit, but as Danielle, as you just said, other people benefit because they suddenly realize they're not going through this all by themselves, and they're not the first one to ever go through it. Other people have and are. And I think through our stories, God connects us at a heart level. I mean, we could give them information about how to heal and how to walk through the process. But when they actually get connected at a heart level by hearing our story and what we've lived and what God's done in our lives, I think it's that much more encouraging, don't you?
Absolutely. And Greg, I know we could continue. We could go on. Both of us are chatters.
Yeah.
We could go on for hours here. So I appreciate your friendship. I'm thankful for the work that you and Kathy do. And also just the way that you've shared honestly about what you have walked through in this season. And I'm just so hopeful as we continue to share stories and like talk about these conversations that people find their way to God. They find a path to know that they're not alone.
Absolutely. And I would echo something that Danielle just said. Kathy and I value our relationship, our friendship with you, Danielle. And for those of you who don't know, we actually got to meet briefly last summer in South Carolina, put faces with names and conversations. And, we are so blessed to have you guys in our lives. And thank you so much for making this happen. It's interesting to be on this end of a podcast because normally, like you, I'm hosting. So it was fun. It's a hard subject, but this has been good because I think it does give people hopefully an accurate glimpse into what life is like and that there is hope. Thank you, Danielle, and thank you for all that you do on your podcast.
Thank you so much for listening today. I hope it made you reflect a bit on how we can interact with others in a kind and compassionate way. And yeah, it's still going to be awkward, but we're going to just try to keep learning and growing, right? All the ways to connect with Greg or to hear his podcast, simply visit daniellezapchenk.com for details. And here are 2 reflection questions from our time with Greg. Number 1, building a support system is crucial when we are dealing with grief. So who was that for you that played a vital role in a challenging time? And why was that so meaningful to you? Number 2, we all can say truly dumb stuff just because maybe we feel awkward. We've never even experienced a conversation like this before, or maybe we have misconceptions. What would be some ways that we could navigate that in the future by having 1 or 2 meaningful questions we just kind of lock away so that when the time comes, we can compassionately listen and love others? If you like this episode and you missed our previous conversation, you can just go back 1 episode to number 142 and hear kind of what that internal process is for somebody who's in a time of loss or grieving. Also, I appreciate Eric, my husband, for his editing abilities and making us sound so great. That's going to do it for today. I'm grateful that you took the time to spend it with me and Greg. Remember, your parable showcases how God is with you and he doesn't want you to be alone. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.